I love video games. I think they're the greatest medium for storytelling and narrative. In books and films, you simply observe the actions of your plucky protagonist. However, in video games, you're given the opportunity to survey, plan the situation, and enact actions of said protagonist. When done right, you feel more active in the narrative and story of the world your character interacts with, and feel like your actions mean something. However, if there's one glaring flaw in video games, it's the portrayal of female characters in action games. This can tend to be a mixed bag. Sometimes characters are not sexualized, with strong feminist portrayals, easily passing the Bechdel test. Other times, they tend to be objectified, sexualized, and demeaned for audience amusement and pleasure. The question we gotta ask here though, why are women portrayed this way? For the nature of this exploration, I'll be mainly looking at games with female protagonists. This is because while yes, there are a load of action games with female side characters, they're often regulated to love interest or quite literally objectified, with them being trophies to be saved from evil. A lot of time is not spent developing them. Custom characters will not be explored because they're a projection of you and your ideals. If you wish them to be sexualized, it shall be so. If you wish them to be strong, independent women, they will be. When it comes to custom characters, men can be just as sexually objectified as the women are. These characters are essentially gender neutral. Most of these games allow men to wear the exact same clothes as women do, and vice versa. No, in order to examine women, we need actual female protagonists. The problem here is that we need samples, because video games are a diverse medium, to say the least. This is a hard task though. Character portrayals are so different that there are exceptions and anomalies for every ruling on the character I choose to examine. So, who am I gonna choose to be my samples? Well, as a matter of fact, I've chosen 3 characters to explore their iterations. Sample number 1 is Samus Aran from the Metroid series. Sample number 2 is Lara Croft from the Tomb Raider series. And sample number 3 is Jill Valentine from the Resident Evil series. I chose these specific characters because they stand as veteran franchises. Unlike something like Ellie from The Last of Us or Clementine from The Walking Dead, a game I haven't played, these are characters that have existed for a long time. It means we get a sample of how characters have changed, also can see more than one perspective on these characters. They each stand in a different corner of the action game genre. Lara Croft is a much more typical action-adventure game, something along the lines of your Uncharted's. Samus is an action first-person shooter / Metroidvania, allowing us to see how the first-person perspective acts in terms of first-person characters. This allows us to look at stuff like Portal and other games of that nature. And Jill is an action horror game, allowing us to see how horror changes the perception of the female character. This allows us to cover a lot more ground in terms of what action games can mean and how women are portrayed in them. Let's start with Samus. Narratively speaking, she tends to be a lot more active in the story of her game, tending to be the only character within the world. We see the entire world through the eyes of Samus. However, the main issue with her portrayal in the original 3 Metroid games is her womanhood is treated as a twist. You're expecting big epic space hero to be a dude, but dun dun dun! It's a girl. For the first time, this is progressive as hell in a very meta way, as females in games is not really a thing at this time, but also is treated as an exception to the rule in the like of Sherry A. Inner's essay, Tough Girls, as cited in You Shoot Like a Girl by Sarah M. Grimes. I'm going to slightly change the quotes to fit the character at hand, but I shall quote it for you now. That Samus was the only female recalls Sherry Innes' notion that popular media reduces heroines' power by presenting them as exceptions in otherwise male-dominated genres. In the Prime games, you never leave the visor. To quote You Shoot Like a Girl again, Samus was restricted to the more typical function of Avatar. In many ways, Samus was merely an empty vessel for the player to appropriate, acting little more as a visual representation of the player's action within the game's environment. You never see a woman past the reflection in the visor. Her being swapped out with a man does not affect the plot in any major way. However, in being in the eyes of a female, you are forced to empathize the feeling of the character, filling the void with your own projections. To quote that same essay again, "The void left by Samus's lack of distinguishing characterization can easily be filled by those of the player. The only male involved was the potentially male player who must identify with Samus and therefore adopt a female gaze in order to play the game." This is a situation faced by many other FPSs with female protagonists, such as No One Lives Forever and Portal. For what they lack in direct characterization, they make for with their own projections. You feel for them because you're in their eyes. You think, for they cannot. You make up their feelings in your brain as you play. At her worst, in games like Metroid Other M, she decides to / is forced to work for Adam Malkovich, being subservient to men at the risk of her own life. Within Adam Malkovich's group, she is the only woman, further separating her from the group of males. She must be allowed by Adam to use many of her abilities, even at the risk of her own life or safety. Here is not a flattering portrayal of female characters, as it states that women are only allowed to act if the man in their life allows it. Within that game, Samus is also constantly talking about the baby Metroid from the end of Super Metroid. Having your female action hero obsessed with children is not a great way of portraying a strong female character. The final problem with Samus is her sexualization. Now, for the most part, she isn't sexualized. She wears a fairly androgynous and gender-neutral set of armor, and the people around her don't sexualize her, or even see a relationship with her in a romantic sense. She has fairly typical beauty standards, being thin, clear, white skin, blonde hair, blue eyes. The main issue with this is when you beat the game. If you beat the game within a set period of time or within certain objectives, you are rewarded by her in a scantily clad bra and pants akin to the ending of Alien. In the later games, you are rewarded with her in a skin-tight jumpsuit, referred to as the Zero Suit, as is the case with the more recent Prime games. This is slightly discomforting as a portrayal of female characters. Your reward for being able to beat the game is you get to see tits. That's not a flattering portrayal of females because it implies that their only value is in their sexiness. It objectifies them. Your reward, your trophy, is literally a woman. You see breasts because you did good at the game. Literally treating the woman as an object that you can win. Now, let's take a peek at Lara, shall we? Not in that way, that's gross. Ew. When looking at Lara Croft, you can see a distinct difference in portrayal before the reboot and after the reboot. Before the reboot, Lara is rich, smart, strong, and sexy. A lot of the focus of these early games, however, is on her sexual appeal, with scenes of groping in a body search, quotes of "what's a man gotta do to get the attention of you," and an almost shower scene showing her polygonal ankles and legs, revealing a bathrobe, to which she stops the scene by saying, "Haven't you seen enough?" to which she pulls out a gun. These scenes adopt a level of voyeurism not seen by many male characters in games. Here the character was somebody so rich they could afford to travel around the world, spending their time killing dinosaurs, finding aliens and defeating ancient horrors, and the primary focus was on her breasts. The primary focus, in the visual sense, was placed upon her looks, dressing in extremely inappropriate clothes for locations she was going to, with her hips and breasts having been accentuated to a comedic degree, and not being the kind of physique and shape she should have for her occupation. In a narrative sense, however, she is not strongly objectified. She's an active participant in the story, not frequently being placed in damsel in distress scenarios and needing to save the men around her. For the most part, her actions within her games are from masculine traits. In order for her to survive, she must attain typical masculine traits. Now within gameplay, Lara is a fairly blank slate. These early games did not have much of an emphasis on plot. The games have a total of 15 to 25 minutes worth of cutscenes, and much like Samus is meant to be a projection, but to a lesser degree. Because of the third person perspective of these games, unlike Samus, you must watch what she does, allowing some fairly creepy and objectifying events to take part within these games. Lara becomes far more interesting after her 2013 reboot. She becomes far less sexualized, and her musculature becomes far more prominent. Her beauty becomes far less the focus, and as she gets more roughed up and dirty. In these early games, she explores caves without sweat, blood, or dirt even touching her clothes. Her makeup is still perfectly maintained. In these reboots, however, she leaves the first area dirty, bloody, just managing to scrape by. She lacks makeup. Her breasts and hips are de-emphasized, and her character becomes far closer to the Carol Clover definition of the final girl, being a woman who is not truly feminine and must survive the horrors of survival in order to make it out of her predicament alive. In order for her to attain survival, she must adopt masculine traits. To quote Clover, "The final girl is boyish, in a word. Just as the killer is not fully masculine, she is not fully feminine, not in any case feminine in the ways of her friends. And the final girl has not just manned herself, she specifically unmans the oppressors whose masculinity was in question to begin with. Those she unmans are often the villains, either coded feminine or actually feminine. And she ends up doing this with the manly traits of guns. They're a metaphor for cock, strength, self-reliance, logical thinking, and risk-taking. This similarity with the final girl is a common trait amongst women in action games, where their almost gender neutrality allows them to attain a sense of manhood. The reboot Tomb Raider is still an active participant in the plot, but is also far more abused by the world around them than her former self, following the abused woman trope. To explain, the trope is that a woman can only gain strength after she has felt pain and torment first. By comparison, the original Lara was an Indiana Jones-esque figure, getting into and out of situations while mostly making out unscathed, being far less abused in the process. In this way, Lara is far less sexually objectified. She is still objectified though. The first game loves to have cameras at arse level and likes to see her in wet tank tops, with the tank top slowly breaking away revealing bra, but is also physically objectified in a slightly abhorrent way, with many violent and horrific deaths in her first reboot. By comparison, her male equivalent of Nathan Drake has far less and far more comedic deaths than reboot Tomb Raider does. When Nathan Drake dies in his games, he simply comedically flops on the floor or falls into the abyss, whereas Lara Croft ends up having her face gored against a rock. However, as the games progress, her objectification is slowly diminished. She attains a genuine strength and feminist appeal. With these changes, the reboot Tomb Raider has become a template for female characters within games, making them take a lot more cues from the final girl with a focus on strength rather than their sex, and the fact they have breasts on a person. Her portrayal as a character has slowly gotten better as times have changed, and so too does the world around her. This is far longer than it should have been. Jill, onto Jill, onto Jill. Let's be Jill. It's Jill time. Jill! Jill Valentine, debatedly, is the first video game final girl. There were ones before her, with games like Night Trap and the third Alone in the Dark, but Jill was the first notable one, coming out the same year as Lara Croft. On the surface level, this original iteration of Jill Valentine is a lot more favourable in terms of representation than the original Lara Croft. Her breasts were less exaggerated, with a slight focus on her being more muscular. Again, this is the 90s, she is slightly more muscular. She is still a fucking model, but she's less of a model, and more of a muscular model. She was still a conventionally attractive thin white woman, smaller breasts than the original Lara. Her job was unconventional as female characters go, being a cop. However, within this role, she is the only female character within her campaign. Chris meets with Rebecca, but Rebecca and Jill never meet, thus making her the exception, and making her stand apart, akin to how Samus is portrayed in Other M. To quote that same quote from earlier, the most disturbing feature of Jill's gameplay is that she was frequently subordinate to male characters around her. This was compounded by the fact that Jill was the only female character in the group, other than Rebecca, who only appeared in Chris's gameplay. Accentuating her gender difference, Jill was the only female, recalls Sherry Innes's notion that popular media reduces heroines' power by presenting them as an exception in otherwise male-dominated genres. By making her stand alone as a female in her campaign makes her more subservient to men. As stated in said essay, she's also a lot of the time placed in damsel in distress scenarios, needing to be saved by Barry or the other men around her. In Resident Evil 5, she is quite literally objectified. She is under the brainwashing and mind control of the game's villain Albert Wesker. With this, she's forced to wear skin-tight leather with her chest exposed, showing the mind control device between her breasts. This is fetishizing. This is a fetishization of women. That's what that is right there. That's a fetish. That's a fetish. This is definitely not empowering and not a good portrayal of female protagonists. She may not be a protagonist in 5, however she still is a former protagonist, and to see her demeaned and violated in this way is a misogynist. She's also sexually objectified in many of other games. In the Revelation games, she wears a skin-tight scuba gear with straps for a backpack to accentuate her breasts. In her most recent appearance, the Resident Evil 3 remake, she is characterized way better, showing a more intimate side to her. It also likes to show her fear and trauma from the previous events, going into characterizing that, but she remains the only female character in an all-male cast, and is, much like the final girl, is chased down by the stalking killer, Nemesis. With this element of the Nemesis character, it tends to fetishize the violence towards the woman that characters like Leon don't face with someone like Mr. X. There's a slight level of angry misogyny towards Jill that isn't faced towards Leon or Claire, I think. So, what was the point here? Well, female portrayals in games, when females are portrayed in games, they still to this day remain bisexualized. Not to extreme excessive degrees that they were in the 90s. In certain cases, yeah, they are. There are action games with far more sexually objectified women. Look at a lot of anime games, to be honest. But things are getting better in that regard. On the inverse principle, female characters in games today are far more abused and beaten, and there's this perverse obsession in modern games with seeing women beaten down, torn apart, bloodied and limping. This is disturbing. When your female character has graphic death scenes and her contemporary male competitor has a tasteful fade to black with silly ragdolls or far cleaner kills, you see this level of grotesque, hateful sexism being portrayed with female characters that isn't with male characters. This is something that needs to be amended and that we need to stop doing in games. I believe that having more neutral portrayals of female characters is a much better way of showing them off, because showing them as more neutral and much less gendered as female by adding or removing elements from them makes their portrayal much more fair. Females in games deserve a far more fair portrayal and far less violent treatment, and they deserve a far less sexualized treatment in games. And I think we can get there. There are loads of games out there that do not sexualize their women and have fairly progressive ideals being pushed, and I think if we continue on this road long enough,